Hello there. Do you think Roman food was all gruel and gladiator-sized portions? Well, think again. What if I told you the emperors feasted on dishes so unexpected, they'd make a modern Michelin star chef blush? Prepare to challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient Roman dining as we unveil their astonishing culinary secrets. Picture this. You step into a bustling Roman kitchen in the year 100 CE. Steam curls from a bubbling pot of spelt porridge. Slaves scurry about carrying wicker baskets overflowing with figs and olives, and the air is thick with the tangy scent of garum, the beloved Roman fish sauce. If you ever wondered what our toga-wearing ancestors really ate beyond the dramatic feasts in the movies, strap in. You are about to uncover the tasty, sometimes bizarre, and often surprisingly down-to-earth world of ancient Rome's food scene. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a like, subscribe, or maybe comment on where you are listening from. So whether you are getting ready to settle down for the night, looking for a distraction from work or study, or maybe just looking to relax for a while, you found the right place. Quiet the noise of the modern world. Sit back, relax, and we will begin our journey. When we think of ancient Rome, grand marble palaces, mighty legions, and legendary emperors usually come to mind. But for everyday Romans, whether they were wealthy senators or working-class artisans, food was a central part of life and culture. Meals weren't just fuel. They were moments to connect with family, show off social status, and even flirt. Yes, Romans sent saucy, food-themed love notes. This story peels back the layers of history's most famous empire to reveal its culinary secrets. What people actually ate at home, what odd flavors they adored, and how their dining habits shaped society. And just so you know, it isn't all garum and roasted peacock, though there was plenty of that to go around for those who could afford it. Romans typically ate 3 meals a day, though it wasn't as rigid as our modern breakfast, lunch, dinner schedule. Their routine looked something like this. Ientaculum, breakfast. Often a quick, modest meal. Think of it as their grab and go. Bread dipped in wine or spread with honey, perhaps olives, cheese, or leftovers from the previous evening. Mrs. Livia, a busy matron, might have munched on a slice of country bread with fresh fruit while flicking through the morning scrolls. Prandium, lunch. A light midday meal, maybe eggs, salad of lettuce and herbs, or some cold meat. For folks working in the forum, this lunchtime break was more about efficiency than leisure. They'd wolf down a few bites between business meetings, sometimes stopping at a popina, a snack bar, for a plate of lentils or a piece of fish. Cena, dinner. The main event. In wealthier homes, cena started late afternoon and could stretch on for hours, featuring multiple courses. In modest households, it was simpler. Grain porridge, poles, vegetables like leeks and cabbage, and maybe some salted fish. But everyone, rich or poor, saw cena as a chance to relax after the day's work. No matter your social rank, certain staples were pervasive. Grains, wheat and barley underpinned most meals. The poor turned them into porridge, while the rich enjoyed finely milled breads. White wheat bread was a status symbol. If you ate dark, gritty barley bread, you were clearly not rolling in denarii. Legumes, lentils, peas, and chickpeas provided protein and were super versatile. A simple stew of lentils thickened with a splash of olive oil and garum could satisfy even the hungriest laborer. Vegetables, cabbage, leeks, onions, and beets popped up often. Salad greens, dressed with vinegar or wine, offered a fresh counterpoint to heavier dishes. Fruits and nuts, apples, pears, grapes, figs, and dates were in plentiful supply. especially in the Mediterranean climate. Nuts, walnuts and almonds added crunch to both savory and sweet dishes. If you could bottle Roman cuisine in a jar, it would be garum. Made by fermenting fish guts in salt under the scorching sun, then straining out the liquid, this pungent sauce was drizzled over nearly everything: meat, fish, vegetables, even desserts. Rich Romans bought garum imported from Spain or North Africa. Poor families fermented their own in backyard vats, a delightful neighborhood aroma. Garum was to the Romans what ketchup or soy sauce is to us, an all-purpose seasoning. Pliny the Elder complained about overuse, likening it to eating liquid salt, but most diners couldn't get enough. Emperors even had their favorite brands, some costing a small fortune. Romans loved their sweets, though dessert didn't usually come at the end of a meal. Often, sweet foods appeared between courses or as snacks. Popular choices included honey cakes, libum, soft, round cakes made with cheese and drizzled in honey. Perfect to dip into garum. Okay, maybe not perfect, but they did mix sweet and savory in surprising ways. Dried fruits, figs and dates were nature's candy bars, portable and sweet. Dulcia domestica, dates stuffed with nuts and sometimes dipped in honey or wine. Fancy enough for a feast, but easy enough to whip up at home. Mustaceum, something like a modern-day communion wafer, made from grape, must, fresh juice, and served at weddings or festivals. Sweetness in ancient Rome wasn't limited by sugar. Real cane sugar arrived much later. Instead, honey reigned supreme. Wealthy tables might feature imported sweeteners like fruit syrups made from boiled grape juice. The grand banquet of a Roman noble was less a meal and more a theatrical production, with each course designed to astonish and delight the senses. Imagine a long, U-shaped table carved from dark walnut, its surface gleaming with oil as men and women in silk tunics reclined on plush cushions. Slaves moved silently behind them, bearing platters heaped with roasted meats and exotic fruits that most Romans only heard about in travelers' tales. The air shimmered with heat from braziers filled with embers, and everywhere you turned there was someone dabbling a dribble of garum onto their roasted dormouse or nibbling at a slice of stuffed ostrich. The point was not just to eat, it was to display wealth, power, and the host's impeccable taste. In the center of the hall, above the heads of the guests, hung wreaths of laurel and myrtle, symbols of victory and love. It was no accident. A successful feast could make or break a politician's career. Caesar himself once invited senators to a repast so lavish that they whispered it cost more than some provinces produced in taxes. Every detail, from the choice of wine to the arrangement of petals on the serving trays, was calculated to convey status. Even the seating order mattered. The closest spots to the head of the table went to the most important allies, while those lower down had to endure the occasional scowl from their superiors as they reached for the next course. Despite the ostentation, the recipes often began with humble roots. A master cook would start by reducing a syrup of wine and honey until it thickened into something like modern molasses. That syrup might get spiced with pepper imported from India or saffron from Spain. Meanwhile, dormice were fattened on walnuts and chestnuts for weeks, then sewn up in tiny linen sacks and roasted whole. The idea of eating a plump dormouse might make a modern diner squirm, but for a Roman gourmand, it was the height of luxury. Other prized treats included the tongues of flamingos, whose bright color was said to hint at their rich flavor, and the brains of peacocks, which, if you believed rumor, tasted faintly of the bird's plumage. Regional influences crept in as Rome's borders expanded. The spice routes from the east brought ginger and cinnamon, revolutionizing sweet dishes. From North Africa came the bright red pepper that lent a surprising kick to sauces. In Gaul, rustic cooks showed how to braise young boar in wild herbs, and in Hispania, they taught Romans to press olives into a dark, fruity oil that even today is considered among the finest. Wealthy Romans who owned estates in multiple provinces would shuttle products from one villa to another. A barrel of Spanish garum delivered to Britain, apples grown in Britannia sent back to Rome, creating a pan-Mediterranean menu that celebrated the empire's vast reach. The feast would open with gustatio, a selection of appetizers meant to awaken the palate. Rather than a simple plate of bread and olives, these early dishes were often small bites of art. A host might present stuffed dates wrapped in bacon, their sweetness cutting through the smoky fat, or tiny pastries filled with a paste of fish, nuts, and herbs, shaped into little crescents that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Sometimes a juggler or musician performed here, giving the guests time to sample these morsels while marveling at athletic feats or the mournful plucking of a lyre. As the courses progressed, the conversation tended toward politics, poetry, and, inevitably, gossip. A well-timed witticism could gain a senator favor. A clumsy observation could lead to quiet whispers that echoed through the forum the next day. Wine flowed freely, diluted with water and spiced with honey or rose petals, and it fueled both friendly banter and heated debate. Occasionally, a poor soul overindulged and fell from their reclined position, much to the amusement of everyone present, though the host would swiftly silence any laughter, lest the embarrassment turn into insult. By the time the mains arrived, guests might find platters of peacock presented with feathers splayed like iridescent fans, the flesh beneath glistening with glaze. The cook's pride showed in every brushstroke of sauce and every delicate carving. The meat itself was often tough. Romans had fewer breeds of livestock bred for tenderness, so cooks relied on marination, slow braising, and clever sauces to transform sinew into something succulent. A master of the kitchen understood that flavor came from layering. A base of vinegar-steeped vegetables, a middle note of pungent garum, and a final flourish of sweet raisin wine. After the heavy dishes came a brief pause, a moment to demonstrate wealth with sheer abundance. Tables would be cleared only to be covered again with fresh linens and then heaped with fruits, grapes still warm from the sun, figs bursting with honey, pomegranates whose ruby seeds spilled like eager confetti. Guests debated fiercely over who would have the honor of sampling the last pomegranate, since to win that small privilege was to win the host's favor, at least for a few hours. Then, just when one might think the feast was winding down, came the secunda mensa, the second table. This was dessert, though Romans didn't call it that. It was a means to extend the pleasure and, if necessary, to sober up hungry diners enough to make their way home in a dignified manner. Sweet cakes made with cheese, flat wafers spiced with pepper and dipped in concentrated grape must, and soft confections of almonds and poppy seeds emerged. Some guests found this portion delightfully indulgent. Others groaned, realizing they had little room left. Yet nobody left early. To depart before the secunda mensa was considered rude, as if one had not appreciated the host's generosity. Finally, after hours of feasting, conversation, and occasional somnolence brought on by overindulgence, guests reclined one last time with a portion of spiced wine called mulsum. It was wine blended with honey and sometimes flavored with cinnamon or bay leaves. With this sweet sip, the evening wound down. Slaves drifted among the couches, offering napkins and water to rinse fingers, and the host rose to express his gratitude. Invitations to the next gathering were hinted at, alliances solidified, and with that, the guests reluctantly rose, adjusted their togas, and stepped out into the cool night air, cheeks flushed and bellies full. These banquets were more than mere spectacles of excess. They were microcosms of Roman life where politics, culture, and daily routine intertwined over shared plates. The same skilled hands that tamed wild boar and perfected garum taught generals how to plan campaigns and senators how to finesse alliances. Food was diplomacy, entertainment, religion, and science all rolled into one. And perhaps most importantly, it was an art form that united an empire. In our next installment, we'll explore how the common people experienced Rome's culinary culture far from marble halls. We'll visit street stalls where freemen and slaves alike grabbed a quick bite. We'll learn about the baker who rose before dawn to knead dough in the bakery's smoky kitchens. And we'll peek into a sculptor's home kitchen to see how an artist turns simple ingredients into masterpieces. Along the way, we'll meet recipes that have survived 2 millennia and still grace our plates today. Hold on to your vine leaf crowns. There's plenty more flavor to uncover in ancient Rome. As dawn broke over the tenements of Ostia, the harbour town that fed Rome's appetite for grain, the streets came alive with the clatter of wooden carts and the murmur of voices. At the corner of a narrow alley stood a thermopolium, an open-faced shop pocked with stone jars of steaming stews and sauces. Here, free men on their way to the docks and tired labourers returning from the quarries stopped for a hot bowl of pulse, the porridge of the poor, thick with spelt and flavoured with a swirl of olive oil. Overhead, the curved counter was painted with bright frescoes of a rooster or a lobster, a simple way to say, "Come in and eat." Behind the counter, a stout innkeeper ladled out portions from clay pots, calling out prices in coins. Patrons ate standing, wiping beards and fingers with scraps of cloth, and hurried on, pockets jingling with the weight of their morning meal. Just a block away, the bakery's door swung open to reveal floors dusted with flour and ovens built into the brick walls. The baker, up before the sun, mixed long strands of dough in a trough the size of a small wagon wheel. Kneading was done by hand, feet, and sometimes even elbows, until the paste murmured under pressure. Shaped into large, round loaves called panis quadratus, the bread bore stamped patterns that marked its weight and price. Some loaves were enriched with milk and honey for wealthier customers. Others, smaller, denser, and baked with a generous crackle of crust, were sold to soldiers as panis militaris, their rations for long marches. As the ovens crackled, the baker's assistant slid loaves in and out with a long wooden paddle, filling the alley with the smelling of fresh bread that could tempt even a city magistrate out of his carriage. Meanwhile, in a modest insula not far off, a sculptor named Lucius prepared his midday meal in a culina so tiny that the cook had to step outside to turn the spit. The kitchen's hearth was little more than a fire pit ringed with stones, but Lucius made it sing. He tossed diced cabbage and onions into a heavy iron pan, poured a ladle of garum for punch, then added cubes of pork he had traded for the bakery's stale bread. As the mixture sizzled, he dredged meritum, the rustic cheese and herb spread, from a wooden bowl, rubbing garlic, parsley, coriander, and a handful of pecorino together with a mortar and pestle until the paste gleamed green and white. He spread it thick on the day-old bread, the heat softening the cheese so that it melted around the nubs of herb. In just a few minutes, he had a meal that was simple, cheap, and deeply satisfying. The markets of Rome proper were even larger, a warren of stalls piled with fresh fish, game birds, cheeses of countless varieties, and fruits. Sellers from distant provinces set up their goods under striped awnings. A trader from Lusitania offered smoky hams cured with sea salt. A Gaulish vendor sold balls of cheese rumoured to have a pungent, almost wild flavour. Children darted between legs, snatching up olives and tucking them into the folds of their tunics. Overhead, cries in Greek and Aramaic mingled with Latin as the city's inhabitants, free and enslaved, bargained for dinner. In back alleys, a private cook for a matron of standing snipped fresh dill and lovage from pots on her windowsill, supplementing the purchased fare with greens that carried the tang of morning dew. By mid-afternoon, those who could afford it sought out wine bars, where amphorae of Falernian or Caecuban waited to be diluted and spiced. They mingled with their peers, sipping from little bowls called pocula while reclining on couches. Poetry was recited, and gossip was traded like coin. A successful young merchant might boast of striking a deal in Alexandria, while a defeated senator grumbled about the rising price of grain. Yet whether you drank chilled onyx-coloured Falernian or the rough red wine of the countryside, the act of sharing a cup bonded Romans in a ritual as old as the city itself. At home, cooks and housewives kept recipe scrolls, fragments of which survive today in the collection attributed to Apicius. These clerked lines detailed how to turn a piece of boar into a feast, with nothing more than pepper, lovage, and wine. The instructions were often terse: boil, mash, season, serve. But hidden in the gaps were clues to the creativity of Roman kitchens. A pinch of asafoetida, though imported and costly, could mimic the sharpness of onions in winter. A handful of pine nuts added crunch and aroma to sauces smeared over fish. In the wealthier districts, cooks practiced the art of creating diffuse flavors, layering sweet, sour, bitter, and salty in harmony. Festivals brought their own culinary customs. During Saturnalia, families feasted on a special round cake called placenta, layered with cheese, honey, and flour, then baked until crisp. May's Floralia featured burekas filled with spring vegetables and honey, celebrating the new growth. In late summer, the grape harvest produced must, fresh juice that was boiled down into a sweet syrup, named de frutum, used to glaze meats or stirred into wine. Such celebratory foods punctuated the year like punctuation marks, lending rhythm to civic life. But not every meal was grand or even comfortable. Down by the Tiber's edge, refugees from neighbouring lands camped in flimsy huts, surviving on whatever fish the river spat up and on the charity of distant relatives. The city's grain dole, an allowance of subsidised barley or wheat, sustained millions. Long queues formed at dusty granaries, where the poor exchanged their bronze tokens for the promise of tomorrow's bread. Hacks, who cooked in communal hearths, might offer a swirl of hot porridge for a few coins, but most people learned to stretch ingredients to fill empty bellies. In kitchens across the empire, metal tables groaned under the weight of vessels, bronze cauldrons blackened by flame, earthenware bowls mottled with mineral deposits, and fine silver goblets polished by impatient hands. Ingredients trundled in from every corner of the known world: peppercorns from India, almonds from the Levant, dates from Arabia, and olives from the rugged hills of Hispania. Such diversity spoke of Rome's reach and influence. And yet, at its heart, Roman cooking was about making the ordinary extraordinary. A few handfuls of grain, a drizzle of oil, a dash of spice, and you could summon flavors that transcended time. Before we journey on, pause and imagine this. You, standing in a smoky kitchen lined with pots and pans, learning to stir garum into a bubbling stew, the smell of herbs tangling with roasting meat. You taste the sweet heat of defrutum on your tongue, the comforting graininess of poles warming your belly. You share wine with strangers and toast to the health of the emperor. This is the world of Roman eating, a world where food was more than sustenance. It was identity, celebration, and sometimes the only language that needed no translation. Next, we'll linger by the hearth of a priestess in Pompeii, uncover the surprising role of street food in religious observance, and sift through the fragments of Apicius to resurrect recipes that you can try in your own kitchen today. Get ready to don your apron or your toga and enter a culinary time machine. In the heart of Pompeii, just beyond the shadow of Vesuvius, the household of a Vestal virgin shimmered with a quiet, sacred glow. Inside the modest atrium, marble inlays depicted scenes of Ceres blessing grain fields, and at the center of the room stood a low hearth, where the priestess herself, wearing the spotless white robes of her order, tended a cauldron of bubbling barley porridge. This wasn't the coarse pulse of a labourer's breakfast, but a gilded version, enriched with a ladle of defrutum, the boiled-down grape syrup so prized for its sweetness. She murmured a blessing to Vesta, goddess of the hearth, while stirring, believing that the purity of her offering ensured the safety of Rome itself. The fragrance of warm grain and honey drifted through the corridors, mingling with the scent of burning laurel leaves that hovered like a promise of divine favour. Just outside the temple gates, the streets of Pompeii teemed with worshippers who brought plates of simple fare as votive gifts. Street vendors, ever attuned to religious calendars, set up wooden stalls piled high with trays of libum, flat, spongy cakes made of cheese and flour. On festival days for Ceres, these cakes were sprinkled with poppy seeds and drizzled with honey. For Venus, pomegranate seeds adorned them like scarlet tears. Devotees stepped forward, slipped a coin into a basket, and set their offerings before small shrines painted on crumbling walls, their faces glowing with hope that the gods would look kindly upon their families, their flocks, or their latest business ventures. This interplay between faith and food extended into the daily routine of street-side thermopolia too. A tired mule driver might pause at a steaming cauldron to scoop up a portion of chickpea stew, then drop a morsel at the feet of a statuette of Fortuna, goddess of luck, before eating. He whispered a quick prayer, not trusting that garum-laced broth alone could steer him safely through narrow mountain passes. In that tiny gesture, tasting a holy broth while asking for divine protection, the sacred and the mundane intertwined like the herbs in a sumptuous sauce. Over in a cramped back room of a modest townhouse, a cook flipped through the weathered pages of Apicius, that legendary compendium of recipes attributed to a gourmand of imperial fame. The script was terse and sometimes perplexing. Take of nuts and pepper, fry, grind, add honey. Far from discouraging creativity, this brevity ignited it. The cook experimented by blending pine nuts with black peppercorns freshly pounded in a bronze mortar, stirring in a spoonful of honey until the mixture thickened into a fragrant paste. Brushing that paste onto skewers of lamb, she roasted them over glowing embers until the meat charred at the edges, the sweet spicy glaze caramelizing into a sticky lacquer. The result was a dish so unexpected that one guest declared it worthy of a triumphal procession. Another fragment of Apicius described an artichoke stew made with vinegar and mint. The cook gathered artichoke hearts, tender and pale, and cut them into slivers. She boiled them gently in water seasoned with wine vinegar and aromatic herbs, then finished the dish with a scattering of fresh mint leaves. As she served it, the air filled with a crisp, green perfume that reminded diners of hidden gardens and cool, shaded groves. Guests crunched the artichokes between their teeth, marveling at how such humble leaves could taste so refined. Where wealthier Romans relied on cooks to reinvent these ancient scripts, the humbler folk of Ostia took different inspiration. An elderly fishmonger, whose stall overflowed with fresh catch each dawn, recalled an Apician sauce of fermented oysters. Lacking the luxury of preserved oysters, he substituted small mussels, steaming them open and draining off the briny juices. He added a finger's pinch of asafoetida, imported at great expense to mimic onion sharpness, and stirred the mixture into a broth of split peas. Customers gathered around his stall, drawn by the odd aroma, and left with bowls of soup, whose flavour struck somewhere between the sea's chill and the pungent warmth of spiced vegetables. In villas perched on terraced hillsides, where wealthy landowners staged elaborate dinners for visiting dignitaries, cooks embarked on more ambitious revivals. One chef discovered a recipe for a boiled goose swimming in a sauce of white wine, coriander, and lavish. He sourced a hefty bird, bathed it in lukewarm water to loosen feathers, then simmered it gently until the meat yielded to the fork. While it cooked, he crushed seeds of coriander and fennel, mixed them with fresh stalks of lavish, and poured in a crisp vintage from Campania. The kitchen filled with a heady scent of anise and wine, and when the goose emerged, glistening and tender, guests declared it a masterpiece worthy of the imperial table. Beyond these kitchen revivals, some recipes thrived unchanged through centuries of retelling. Honey biscuits, small diamond-shaped pastries flavoured with a hint of pepper, appeared on nearly every table, festive or ordinary. Households large and small mixed fine semolina with honey and a dash of pepper, kneaded the dough until it held together, then cut it into shapes before baking. The result was a treat that tasted sweet, with a surprising gentle heat at the finish. Children nibbled them alongside their afternoon wine diluted with water, while elders offered them to guests alongside a cup of mulsum. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Roman cooking, though, was its system of sauces. Garum may have reigned supreme, but the concept of seasoning food with pungent, fermented condiments has travelled the world. Modern fish sauces in Southeast Asia, the umami-rich pastes of Korea, and even the Worcestershire sauce beloved in Britain, all trace an ancestral line back to those vats bubbling beneath the Italian sun. When the Roman Empire broke apart, its culinary ideas spread with merchants, soldiers, and settlers, sowing seeds of flavour that sprouted in diverse soils. As the sun sank behind Vesuvius, painting Pompeii's rooftops in shades of gold and crimson, daily life continued beneath a veil of sacred ritual. Offering bowls of porridge to Vesta, scattering chunks of libum before neighbourhood shrines, cooking Apician recipes both grand and simple, all of these acts wove a tapestry of belief, innovation, and community. The people of ancient Rome ate not only to live, but to connect with one another and with the divine, sometimes through extravagance, sometimes through frugality, but always with an eye toward honouring tradition. In your modern kitchen, you might recreate that barley porridge sweetened with defrutum and imagine you stand by the Vestal hearth, or prepare spiced lamb skewers with crushed pine nuts and honey, and taste what once paraded through marble atria. Each dish is a bridge across time, a whisper of voices long silenced, and a reminder that food carries memory. It tells the story of an empire all the way from the taverns of Pompeii to the banquet halls of Rome's elite, a story of harvests and hunts of markets and temples, and of people who, despite the centuries, remain as hungry for connection as we are today. So now, let's turn from kitchens to farms and vineyards, tracing how grain fields and olive groves shaped Roman society. We'll follow a vintner whose grapes climbed hillside trellises, learn how olive oil was pressed by slaves at dawn, and discover how those simple plants fueled an empire that lasted for a millennium. Prepare to journey into the fields where the ingredients began, and see how the very soil of Italy became the secret ingredient in Rome's everlasting feast. As dawn's first light spread across the rolling hills of Latium, the dew on the spelt fields glimmered like tiny jewels. The hum of bees drifted through the air, busy among the purple blooms of wild thyme. Here, long before the bustle of the city, Rome's culinary story began in the soil itself. A small band of farmhands, some free, most enslaved, moved between the rows of grain, their sandals leaving soft imprints in the damp earth. Their overseer, a lanky farmer named Marcus, watched as they bent to cut stalks of wheat with sickles fashioned from bronze. Sweat beaded on his brow as he imagined those golden grains milled in the villa's mill and kneaded into loaves that would feed the city's hungry masses. On a nearby terrace, vines climbed support poles made of olive wood. That vineyard belonged to Livia Julia, a retired centurion's widow, who took as much pride in her grapes as he once took in his campaigns. Every spring she inspected the tender buds, whispering to them in a soft voice that blended Latin with a sprinkle of the local dialect. She believed that kindness coaxed better sugar into the berries. When the berries swelled in the sun and the lower vines sagged under their weight, she called her vintner, Gaius, to test the sweetest clusters. He plucked a handful, crushed them between his fingers, and tasted the juice. If it was too sharp, he would wait another week. If it was sweet enough to make his tongue tingle, he would give the word to harvest. Olive groves lay beyond the grape arbor, where slender trees stood like silent sentinels. Each tree was at least a century old, its twisted trunk testament to years of autumn harvests. During the hottest month, workers arrived before dawn carrying wicker baskets. Under the dim glow of oil lamps, they shook branches and gathered olives that fell in a soft carpet beneath their feet. Some olives were destined for pressing into oil so pungent that a single drop could transform a plate of boiled greens into a feast. Others, cured in brine and spiced with coriander, would fill serving bowls throughout the year. Livia Julia insisted that olives be picked by hand rather than beaten from the branches, fearing that broken skins would sour the oil. Back on the grain fields, the harvest continued as wagons rattled toward the rustic mill. The wooden gears turned slowly, powered by oxen trudging in circles. Inside, water from a nearby stream gurgled through lead-lined channels, carrying the grain into millstones that ground the kernels into flour and bran. Labourers shifted sacks laden with freshly milled wheat into the bakery's loft. By mid-morning, the air inside the mill was thick with the scent of earth and morning air, a reminder that so much of Roman cooking depended on simple, honest work. A few miles away, in a villa perched atop a limestone ridge, winemaking took on a grander scale. Gaius, the vintner, supervised a bustling team of grape-stained workers. They used a wooden press to crush grapes, the tannic juice spilling into a cistern below. After the must settled, they ladled off the clear liquid into jars, discarding the dregs to feed pigs. The new wine, still cloudy with bloom, would ferment for weeks. Gaius trained his slaves to sniff for off aromas and to skim frothy lees from the top. He would test its strength at every stage, dipping a reed into the jar and touching it to his tongue, an art he had learned from Greek teachers in Athens. When the wine reached the right balance of sweetness and acidity, he would seal the jar with clay and a lid of woven reeds. Meanwhile, not all the fields were vast estates. Smallholders eked out a living on narrow strips of land closer to the city. One such man, Publius, managed half an acre of vegetables and herbs behind his modest townhouse. He grew leeks, caraway, and lavish, plants that gave Roman dishes their distinctive tang. Every dawn and dusk he wandered the patch, inspecting for aphids or signs of mildew. If a leaf curled too sharply, he clipped it off, fearing the entire plant might wilt. Publius sold his surplus at the market, trading bundles of fresh herbs for pottery jugs or a small parcel of grain. He dreamed of expanding his patch, but city taxes and the whims of magistrates often nipped such ambitions in the bud. Between the olive groves and the grain fields lay orchards where pear and fig trees ripened in late summer. The figs, dark and plump, attracted swarms of wasps, so pickers worked swiftly, wearing woven straw hats to shade their eyes. They laid the fruit in shallow baskets lined with fig leaves to prevent bruising. Some figs were fresh eaten under vine-leaf pergolas. Others were dried in the sun on flat rooftops, their sugars concentrating until each bite became a saccharine burst. Pears, harvested a little earlier, were preserved in jars of defrutum or sun-dried into chips that crackled like autumn leaves when you bit into them. All this labour fed directly into Rome's kitchens. In the city, cooks crafted the land's bounty into dishes that varied by season. Spring brought green stew spiked with new herbs. Summer called for light fare. Vine leaves stuffed with barley and mince meat, cooked in lemon-bright wine. Autumn feasts showcased roasted game birds from the nearby hills, served with a sauce of pomegranate molasses. Winter tables, hardy and comforting, featured root vegetables stewed with bacon and wild herbs, or pulmentum, a thick porridge enriched with bits of cheese and a dash of pepper. Beyond providing ingredients, farms and vineyards fostered community. Harvest festivals united neighbours. Workers shared simple meals of fresh bread, salt-cured pork, and watered-down wine to celebrate the gathering of crops. Livia Julia hosted a modest first fruits feast under her olive trees, inviting Publius and Marcus and their families. They reclined on crates draped in cloth, passing around loaves still warm from the oven and cups of wine glinting in the amber light. They laughed as children chased sparkles of embers from a nearby hearth, and in their simple joy you could glimpse the heart of Roman life. A mix of toil, friendship, and the quiet pride that comes from turning earth into food. These farms also signalled the hard truths of empire. Landowners like Livia Julia grew wealthy from the labour of countless hands, many of them enslaved, and that wealth fuelled Rome's expansion. Grain surpluses paid for soldiers, olive oil lit the public baths, and wine lubricated the wheels of politics in the Senate. Yet the same system that built empires also created tensions. Slaves revolted, as in Sicily, demanding freedom. Smallholders struggled under heavy taxes and red tape. Every barrel of wine or sack of grain carried with it the weight of social struggle, of hope and hardship woven together. If you close your eyes while standing in a modern vineyard, breathe deeply, and let the scent of crushed grapes fill your nostrils, you might sense the whisper of Roman vintners. In the gritty sand of an olive grove, if you lean close to a gnarled trunk, you can almost hear the whispered encouragements of a devoted widow urging her trees to thrive. And in the faint rustle of wheat stalks swaying in the breeze, you may feel the rhythm of bronze sickles swinging at dawn, hands stained by earth, working to transform grain into daily bread. As the sun sinks low over those same ancient fields, the cycle begins anew. Farmers ready their tools, vintners taste their barrels, and cooks in the city prepare for the next season's flavors. The legacy of those hands shapes what we eat today. Olive oil in our dressings, bread on our tables, wine at our gatherings. In every sip and every bite, we taste not only ingredients, but centuries of labor and love. Next, we'll return to Rome itself to explore how food shaped family life, from humble kitchens to grand banquets, and how children learned the art of cooking alongside their mothers and older siblings. We'll hear tales of kitchen mishaps that invited laughter, of recipes passed down like precious heirlooms, and of the invisible bonds that tied Romans together at the dinner table. Prepare to step back into the alleyways and atria, where the heart of Roman cuisine beats still. In a modest townhouse on one of Rome's quieter streets, the day began before dawn's first light crept through the shutters. Aelius, a pudgy 8-year-old with a mop of dark curls, padded down the narrow corridor while rubbing sleep from his eyes. His mother, Flavia, was already in the kitchen, tending the hearth fire so it crackled bright and hot. She stood at a low bench, cutting strips of cured ham into thin ribbons that she would later fold into the morning bread dough for a special treat. Aelius watched her for a moment, inhaling the mingled scents of smoke, yeast and salt, and realized he had never before paid such close attention to the alchemy that happened here each day. Flavia noticed him behind her and offered a crooked smile. "Fetch the water, my son," she said, nodding toward a clay jar in the corner. Aelius obeyed eagerly, hefting the heavy vessel and straining to lift it. As he carried it to the hearth, he imagined himself as a famous gladiator, strong and brave, though the clink of pots on the hearth made him think more of the clatter of armor in the training yard. Back at the bench, he poured the water into a large bowl of flour, watching clouds of white dust swirl up and settle like tiny ghosts. His mother guided his small hands to knead gently, teaching him how to press and fold the dough until it felt smooth under his fingers. While the bread rose, Flavia reached for a small bag of lentils and began rinsing them under cool water. She hummed a lullaby she had learned from her own mother, a simple tune about land and harvest and home. Aelius clapped along, off-key but enthusiastic, and Flavia laughed, her voice bright like chimes. Soon the lentils would simmer in a pot with olive oil and bits of garlic, creating a stew that would nourish their family and leave their neighbors peeking curiously over the walls for a taste. Aelius liked the sound of that. Food so good that it made people line up for more. By mid-morning, the dough had doubled in size, and Flavia pulled it gently from the bowl. She flattened it with her palms and instructed Aelius to press his little thumbs into the soft surface, leaving perfect dimples. "These will be our morning buns," she explained, "filled with ham and cheese, like the ones sold at the Forum." Aelius threw himself into the task, giggling as his thumbs sank too deep and the dough sagged through his fingers. When one of his indentations collapsed, Flavia teased him gently. "You're making dough caves, not indentations," and coaxed him to try again. While the buns baked, Flavia showed Aelius how to roll out a thin sheet of dough for moritum, the garlicky cheese spread that people loved on new bread. She handed him a mortar and pestle and a handful of parsley. "Crush the herbs," she said, "until they smell like spring." Aelius mashed them vigorously, sending green flecks into the air. He pressed too hard once, and the pestle clattered down, sending parsley bits bouncing off the wall. Flavia dipped her finger in the olive oil she kept in a small bowl and dabbed a dollop on his nose. "You're doing very well," she said, wiping his nose with the back of her hand. As they worked, neighbours began drifting into the kitchen. The baker's wife brought a basket of warm rolls she had decided were too dry to sell. The fishmonger's daughter arrived with 2 clean mullets, fresh that morning. Flavia greeted each friend with a quick kiss on the cheek and an exchange of news. "Cicero's son is home from Athens," someone whispered. "They're whispering that the new grain levy will make bread cost more," murmured another. All the while, Aelius watched adults talk, noticing how food connected gossip, politics, and everyday life into one steady stream. When the buns came out of the oven, golden and crisp at the edges, the household crowed with delight. Flavia sliced one open and spread meritum generously inside, and Aelius bit in, his eyes widening at the warm, salty flavour. Sweet ham melted into creamy cheese, herbs tickled his tongue, and the bread's crust crackled under his teeth. He closed his eyes and chewed slowly, as if each bite was a treasure he were discovering for the first time. Around him, the adults sampled their own buns, nodding and offering thumbs up, voices tinged with envy that their children got the first taste. That afternoon, Aelius's older sister, Lucia, returned from the School of Rhetoric, where she studied with other young noblewomen. In her hands, she carried a clay tablet inscribed with a poem about the river Tiber. She practiced reciting it in the kitchen, voice strong and clear, while Flavia stirred the pot of lentils, its steam forming small halos in the sunlight. Lucia leaned over the fire, fanning it gently with a piece of folded parchment, and the flames caught the edges of the page. With a gasp, Aelius darted forward and smothered the fire with a woolen cloth, saving his sister's poem from the flame. Lucia thanked him, breathless, and declared that this would be the day her little brother earned his first token of bravery. As the sun dipped low, the family gathered in the atrium to share their meal. A rough wooden table had been set with bowls of lentil stew, plates of meritum buns, and cups of watered-down wine for the adults, honeyed for the children. They reclined on cushioned benches, leaning on one elbow as they ate, filling the courtyard with laughter and conversation. Aelius watched as his mother lifted her cup, toasted to the health of their household, and then everyone echoed her. In that moment, he understood that food was never just food in Rome. It was blessing and celebration, comfort and tradition woven into every gesture. Later that night, after the hearth's embers had dimmed and the family settled into their beds, Aelius dreamed of running through fields of wheat with a garum-flavoured breeze ruffling his hair. He imagined kneading dough for thousands of buns, feeding crowds at great public feasts. In the dream, his mother's lullaby drifted over him, promising that as long as they had each other, mother, father, sister, and brother, they would never truly hunger. Cooking lessons and family meals shaped Aelius's world, just as they shaped the lives of millions of Romans. Children learned to knead, pour, and season not through lectures, but through laughter, mistakes, and gentle guidance at the hearth. Recipes were not written in cold ink, but carved into memory by taste and touch. The precise blend of herbs in meritum, the perfect crackle of a golden bun, the weight of a heavy water jar carried across the stone floor. Each kitchen mishap, a scorched stew, a dough that refused to rise, became a story to tell, a bond that knit families closer over shared smiles. In grand villas too, young nobles learned the culinary arts, though their lessons involved French-trained chefs and imported spices instead of humble legume stews. They tasted the same sweet mustum that dripped from the presses of Livia Julia's vineyards, and they squeezed olives for oil that carried the perfume of the countryside. In doing so, they learned the value of labor, the cycles of the seasons, and the power of hospitality. For Romans knew that food was the glue that bound them to the land, to the gods, and to one another. Let's now take a little trip beyond the city walls and across the Mediterranean, following Roman traders on their journeys to acquire the rare ingredients that fueled imperial appetite. We will sail with grain ships from Alexandria, track caravans of spices from the Arabian Peninsula, and discover how those exotic flavors transformed Roman tables, and indeed, our own. The journey continues, and with it, the story of how ancient Rome feasted the world. Under a dazzling Mediterranean sun, the great grain ships of Rome lurched and groaned as they crept down the Nile toward Alexandria's bustling harbour. These massive vessels, laden with stacked sacks of Egyptian wheat, were the lifeblood of the empire. Their sails billowed with the desert breeze, and at the helm stood Publius Decius, a seasoned sea captain whose weathered face told tales of more storms than most Romans ever dared imagine. Every grain he carried was destined for Rome's Horea, enormous warehouses where merchants unloaded cargo by torchlight. From there, the wheat would feed the plebeians on the city's grain dole, fill granaries in distant garrisons, and even supply bakeries in far-flung ports as Rome's fingers stretched ever wider across the map. Publius was proud of his work, though the sea could be fickle. He liked to tease his captain's mates by telling grand stories of leviathans below deck and sirens luring sailors to their doom. His first mate, a young man named Livius, rolled his eyes but never grew tired of hearing those sea salt yarns. When they reached Alexandria, the harbour was alive. Greek merchants shouted over the gaps in their togas. Egyptian sailors laboured under the groan of capstans, and Persian traders flaunted bolts of silk as fine as mist. Publius guided his ship alongside a stone quay, and soon sacks of golden wheat tumbled from deck to dock in a pitter-patter that sounded like a distant rain. Not all trade involved grain, of course. While Publius's ship carried the staple of life, other vessels carried wonders whose names most Romans mispronounced. Spice merchants, often Greek or Syrian, brought peppercorns harvested on India's Malabar coast. Those tiny black beads were worth their weight in silver, and even nobles scraped them into every dish, hoping to impress dinner guests with tales of far-off lands. Pepper was known to leave tongues tingling and bellies warm, and Roman gourmands guarded their stores jealously. A single peppercorn might retail for more than a loaf of bread. For those who could afford it, pepper turned plain boiled meats into exotic feasts. From the Red Sea's ports came shipments of frankincense and myrrh, not for cooking, but for worship and perfume. Still, a daring cook might grind a few resin granules into a honey glaze for fowl, producing a heady aroma that sent guests swooning, though some found the taste oddly reminiscent of temple incense. These fragrances drifted through patrician dining rooms, mingling with the smoke of oil lamps and the sharp tang of garum. It was said that too much incense-flavoured sauce could send a guest into sneezing fits, but the risk was part of the thrill. Across the Syrian desert, slow caravans ambled under the sun, laden with sacks of cinnamon and cassia. Caravansaries, rough inns carved into rocky cliffs, offered shade and water to camels whose humps shed sweat like miniature fountains. One such trader, a robust fellow named Antipas, spent weeks guiding his camels from Palmyra to Antioch, where ships awaited to carry his precious cargo to Ostia. Cinnamon was prized for its sweet heat. Romans stirred it into wine or mixed it with honey for cakes that tasted of autumn fires and faraway forests. Yet spice wasn't the only exotic product to cross the empire's borders. Silks from China arrived via merchants who navigated the Silk Road's dizzying loops through Central Asia. These shimmering fabrics weren't edible, but they draped the shoulders of wealthy matrons who hosted banquets as lavish as any feast in Peking. Stories circulated that the pink-ribbed silkworms of Cathay were fed only on leaves from a mythical mulberry tree. Whether true or not, the mystery made silk seem as magical as any potion. Back at Rome's bustling port of Ostia, amphorae arrived not just empty, but filled with olive oil from Hispania's groves and wine from Gaul's vines. The jars, sealed with clay stoppers and stamped with the producer's mark, piled high along the quayside. Dock workers heaved them onto carts that rattled into the city's twisting streets. Households, both grand and humble, popped open the stoppers to dribble oil into pans or decant wine for the evening's repast. That same oil would light lamps at night, and the wine would lubricate tongues at lively dinner discussions. In the midst of all this commerce, Rome's spice market was a curious blend of chaos and sophistication. The forum's western end buzzed with booths where merchants offered tastes of musty cinnamon, sweet saffron, and brackish fish sauces. Curious shoppers pinched off bits of saffron threads to sniff between polished fingers, while cooks traded whispered tips on blending pepper with crushed dates for a sauce that made even bland meat sing. It was in these cramped market alleys that the alchemy of Roman cooking truly flourished, in the crowded press of people where scents collided and every haggling voice added spice to the air. What's remarkable is that, despite the dizzying distances, the Romans managed to integrate these ingredients into everyday life. A family in a modest insula might splurge on a tiny jar of imported black pepper for a guest's visit, carefully rationing it through grumbling children and skeptical cooks. A baker might sprinkle cinnamon on buns reserved for the feast day of Saturnalia, creating spice pockets of joy amid the colder months. Even the poor felt the tide of trade. Scaled-down versions of new sauces found their way into gruel made from scant barley, where a dash of ginger or coriander brightened an otherwise meagre bowl. The logistics of moving so much food also transformed Rome's infrastructure. Roads grew wider and straighter, built by soldiers itching for steady work between campaigns. Milestones marked the distances to key cities, not just for war councils but for merchants plotting the next caravan stop. Way stations, mansions, sprang up, offering fresh horses, fodder for mules, and rudimentary inns where weary travellers traded news and recipes over communal fires. In this way, the movement of food and goods became more than commerce. It wove the fabric of empire together, binding provinces to the capital through shared flavours and necessities. Of course, not every exotic ingredient survived the journey unscathed. Tales spread of jars of garum leaking fishy brine during a storm, sending crews scrambling to plug holes with scraps of sailcloth. Some spice shipments spoiled under the desert sun, turning once golden cinnamon into tasteless dust. But these mishaps only fueled legends. Publius Decius, the sea captain, would lean over a barrel of ruined pepper, sniff it skeptically, then grin and declare, "By Neptune's beard, this be the true flavour of adventure." His crew would cheer, raising tankards of wine to celebrate the spice that almost got away. So when next you sprinkle pepper on your pasta, or toss a pinch of cinnamon into your morning porridge, remember how those humble grains travelled deserts, seas, and miles of road to land on your table. Each kernel carries within it the echoes of camel bells in the desert, the creak of an oared galley, and the laughter of Roman merchants haggling under the hot sun. In these humble acts, grinding pepper, drizzling olive oil, swirling wine, you taste the beating heart of an empire that thrived on the pulse of trade, the union of distant lands, and the bold idea that every meal could be an exploration of the world's many flavors. At the break of dawn, beyond the pale of Rome's city walls, the legions stirred in their camps, each cohort laid out in neat rows of white-capped tents. The clank of armor mingled with the hiss of campfires under pots of stewing grain. Here, at the heart of Rome's military might, food was as strategic as the glint of a gladius. A century before marching off to distant frontiers, a legionary named Quintus had learned that victory could turn on something as simple as the freshness of his bread or the warmth of his porridge. Quintus rose before the centurion's horn called the camp to life. He tied his sandals, slipped a cloak over one shoulder against the morning chill, and stepped into the smoky haze of the cook's area. 4 broad-shouldered soldiers stood over a pair of iron cauldrons, stirring a mixture of ground wheat and water that bubbled like muddy lava. This was the soldier's staple, militaris panis, a dense, coarse loaf packed with barley and wheat. It wasn't the light, airy bread of a senator's table, but it held firm under a pack and kept well for days, essential when you were on the march and far from a baker's oven. While the grain cooked, Quintus joined the queue for rations. A weary clerk sat behind a rough-hewn table, dipping his quill into ink to record each soldier's portion in a ledger. Quintus felt a tingle of pride as his name was ticked off. He watched the clerk ladle a scoop of the porridge into his wooden bowl, then pass him a hunk of the dense loaf. For flavour, a few slices of salted pork were pressed into his hand, gift of the quaestor in charge of the camp's funds. Soldiers often joked that salted pork was the army's only seasoning, though some swore that a tiny splash of garum could work wonders even on that salty slab. At the edge of the firelight, a young recruit named Lucius struggled with his bowl. He had enlisted only weeks before and was still getting used to the grueling routine of camp life. A veteran beside him nudged his elbow and offered a grin. "Don't gulp it like venom, boy," he teased. "Taste it. Remember this flavour. This is Rome in your mouth." Lucius nodded, trying to take the jest as encouragement rather than mockery. After all, camaraderie born in the shared ritual of soup and bread could forge stronger bonds than any oath sworn under the eagle standard. By mid-morning, soldiers lined up to grind their daily ration of grain at the camp mill. A pair of mules trod in circles, turning a simple stone wheel that cracked and whined as it pulverized kernels into fresh flour. The dust rose in golden clouds, and men coughed and shielded their eyes, but they knew the effort paid off. Crisp flatbreads baked on hot stones that afternoon would feel like luxury after days of soft porridge. As the sun climbed, officers gathered beneath a canvas awning for a midday meal that mirrored the soldiers' fare, though with a few extra touches. The camp's legate, a bow-tied dignitary with a taste for ceremony, was served a bowl of pulse mixed with lentils, brightened by a handful of fresh herbs grown in a small garden outside his tent. A dish of olives, packed by traders who followed the legions, sat alongside jars of honey that the legate used to sweeten his diluted wine. Even in the field, status mattered. While his men savoured rough bread, the legate nibbled a slice of spongy panis dulcis, enriched with oil and honey, reminding everyone that rank carried privileges even at table. When autumn wines turned sharp and the legions marched into gauntlet-thin fog, the challenge of supply grew greater. Wagons overturned on rutted roads. River barges ran aground on low waters. Yet discipline in provisioning was legendary. Each army corps maintained a commissariat officer whose sole task was to track barrels of wine, sacks of grain, and amphorae of oil. These officers kept meticulous records, scrolls chained to wooden posts, ensuring that no cohort went hungry, even when the legate's eagle standard roamed frontier forests hundreds of miles from Italian farms. It wasn't just soldiers who depended on Rome's food machine. Back in the capital, the grain dole supported thousands of plebeian families. Aulus, a rope-maker's apprentice, stood patiently in line at the massive horea, leather token clutched in his hand. When his number was called, he exchanged the token for a small parcel of coarse barley. That barley, once ground and baked, would sustain his widowed mother and younger sister for days. Every month, at the sight of olive-green tokens fluttering like strange coins at the plaza, the poor felt a tug of gratitude, however grudging, for an empire that saw fit to feed its citizens. Yet they also grumbled, for they knew the dole was as much a tool of political favour as it was charity. Magistrates vied for popularity by promising bigger rations or lower prices on wheat, turning bread into a ballot stump in the highest forum of all. Life in Rome's outlying towns told similar tales. In far-off Britannia, a centurion named Septimius organized a modest banquet for local tribal leaders, hoping to secure peace and tribute. He roasted a boar caught in nearby woods and glazed it with honey sent from Hispania. The tribal chiefs, wary of Latin robes, eyed the honey with suspicion until Septimius dipped a corner of bread in the sticky nectar and offered his arm to them. When the first chief tasted it, his face lit up like a torch. As the meal progressed, laughter spilled around the table, alliances were forged, and Septimius won the gratitude and grain quotas he sought. Even religious festivals bore the imprint of Rome's food networks. At the ancient spring rites of Cerealia, city plebeians paraded woven sheaves of grain through the streets. Families brought crusty loaves to be toasted on household shrines. During the feast of Bacchus, barrels of new wine were poured into public fountains, showering children with purple droplets. From the capital's heights, the pontiffs offered sacrifice and shared the sacred flesh of gored bulls, distributing meat to citizens who pressed close to witness the rite. In every ritual, food reinforced duty to gods, state and household, uniting diverse peoples under Rome's culinary umbrella. Yet for all its reach, Rome's food system was vulnerable to the whims of nature and politics. A late frost could shrivel vine shoots, sending wine merchants to the edge of ruin. A failed Nile flood could starve grain ships of harvest, leaving half the city to line up in bread queues that snaked through dusty plazas. In such times, rumours of hoarded grain sparked unrest. Angry crowds hurled insults at magistrates and sometimes stormed Horea to seize what they believed was their due. Bread and circuses, they roared, demanding not only free grain, but also lavish games to distract them from their hunger. When order returned, administrators reviewed laws more strictly. They banned foreign speculators from buying large grain reserves, imposed price ceilings on oil and wine, and even deputized public slaves to patrol markets for hoarding. These measures rarely pleased merchants, yet they kept the wheels of commerce turning and the stomachs of millions quiet, an extraordinary feat given Rome's sprawling population. In the twilight of his career, Quintus looked back on decades of foreign camps, long marches, and crackling campfires. He had seen grain sail up the Nile, lava-black volcanic ash choke vineyards in Sicily, and camel caravans snake across deserts for a pinch of pepper. He had feasted in grand atria and broken bread in muddy roadside inns. Through it all, he realized that food was more than mere sustenance. It was the force that bound his fellow soldiers, the poor citizens, and even provincial chieftains to the heartbeat of Rome. So when you spread olive oil on your morning bread, or stir a pot of beans at home, remember Quintus and the legion miles from camp, who share a simple bowl of porridge. Remember Aulus clutching his grain token in the throng of Rome's plazas. In every bite of bread, every sip of wine, every grain of pepper flicked over a dish, you taste the legacy of an empire that fed itself and fed its ambition, one meal at a time. Across the centuries that followed Rome's fall, the echoes of its kitchens whispered in monastery refectories and castle halls. When barbarians first sacked the city in the 5th century, they knew little of its laws or its statutes, but they understood grain, and they carried away sacks that once fed legions. Monks in austere robes soon discovered that the old Roman recipe scrolls, tucked away among dusty library shelves, contained more than pious hymns. They found instructions for spiced wine, for curing olives, and for sweet cakes glazed with honey. Copying those recipes by candlelight, they preserved fragments of an empire's taste, even as Europe slumbered through centuries of upheaval. In cloistered kitchens, brothers stirred pots of pottage laced with pepper and garlic, and thought themselves inventing new delights. Yet unknowingly, they followed the same steps a cook in Pompeii had used 2 millennia earlier. Chroniclers wrote of guests marveling at aquae sextiae pepper broth, not realizing that the pepper came all the way from India, shipped in amphorae, much like those that once lined Ostia's quays. In candle-lit stone halls, sauces thickened by boiled-down grape must reminded nuns of de frutum in the Vestal hearth, and flat biscuits spiced with coriander carried the memory of festival breads at Ceres's feast. When the Renaissance swept through Italy, scholars unearthed Apicius's scattered fragments and stitched them together into bound volumes that found their way into noble libraries. Cosimo de' Medici, according to rumour, ordered a copy translated into Latin so he could serve authentic Roman fare at his lavish banquets. English travellers, among them a young Thomas Coriat, marvelled at kitchens that blended artichokes in vinegary stews, mint in sauces, and pine nuts in honeyed spreads. They scribbled notes in margins, and a generation later, recipes derived from Apicius appeared in the earliest printed cookbooks, alongside tips for roasting peacock and marinating dormice, though by then few dared attempt the latter. Across the Alps, French chefs adapted Roman techniques, creating courtside spectacles where head cooks carved birds into the shapes of swans and served sugar sculptures resembling miniature volcanoes. In England, Tudor households imported spice merchants who peddled cinnamon, cloves, and ginger in leather pouches tied with ribbon. There too, cooks mixed ground almonds with pepper to make marchpane, a rich confection that delighted children and diplomats alike. Though most diners never heard of garum, they discovered that anchovy sauce, taught to them by travelling Venetians, could bring similar umami magic to meats and vegetables. By the 18th century, as travel became easier, antiquarians dug into ruined villas at Herculaneum and Pompeii. They uncovered cooking pots, bronze mortars, and amulets painted with small shrines. Archaeologists reconstructed hearths and braziers, learning how Romans coaxed flames to dance under iron pans. Museums exhibited spice jars stamped with maker's marks long faded, and food historians cooked over reconstructed hearths, striving to taste the past. Experimental kitchens, complete with volunteers in tunics, recreated roasting pigs on skewers, pressing grapes in stone presses, and simmering spelt porridge in clay bowls. Yet it was not only grand experiments that kept Roman flavors alive. In homes across the Mediterranean, everyday people maintained a living tradition. In the olive groves of Andalusia, families still press oil by hand, using presses that share the same basic design as those that served Livia Julia's vineyards. In the hills of Tuscany, bakers still bake panis quadratus, patterned with knotwork, stamping dough with symbols to identify weight and quality. In Greek tavernas, they sprinkle oregano and black pepper over fresh tomatoes and cheese. A simple dish, perhaps, but one that reflects the same impulses Romans had when they combined local produce with imported spices to celebrate each season. Even beyond Europe, Roman culinary DNA quietly spread. In parts of the Middle East, you can taste sources of ground chickpeas and garlic, think hummus, that echo the maritim of a Roman kitchen. In North Africa, preserved lemons and fiery Ras el Hanout spice blends reveal a lineage that traces back through Carthage and Rome into the mills of Hispania. Wherever the empire once stood, farmers still grow the same herbs, coriander, lavish, thyme, that perfumed Roman feasts, and cooks still use them to brighten stews and breads. In recent decades, food writers and archaeologists have teamed up to publish guidebooks that lead you on Roman food tours. You can walk the cobbled lanes of Ostia Antica with a chef, sampling dishes cooked over reconstructed hearths, or join an olive oil tasting in ancient presses near Rome. Universities now offer ancient food courses, where students grind grain with replicas of bronze mortars, sift out husks, and bake their own flatbreads. These hands-on experiences remind us that history is more than words on a page. It is a lived, tasted, smelled adventure. At home, you don't need a time machine to sample Roman flavors. A dash of fish sauce in your salad dressing hints at garum. A drizzle of olive oil over fresh herbs echoes pulses once served in Anatolian taverns. A sprinkle of pepper and pine nuts over honeyed figs brings to life the sweets of Saturnalia feasts. Even the simplest kitchen tools, mortar and pestle, cooking pot, bread oven, connect us to that bright, bustling world where cooks coax flavor from humble ingredients and imported luxuries alike. And so, as we draw toward the conclusion of this culinary journey, remember the threads that tie our meals to those of the ancients. Each loaf of bread kneaded today carries the memory of Marcus's farmhands cutting grain at dawn. Each glass of wine savored recalls Gaius's careful taster, leaning over the barrel at the hilltop villa. Each spoonful of stew nods to Aelius and Flavia, sharing maritim buns in their atrium kitchen. And each spice jar on our shelf owes its origin to long-ago traders who braved deserts, seas, and storms to bring flavor to Rome's table. This story has wandered through lavish banquets and humble inns, from sacred hearths to battlefield camps, following the grains, fruits, and spices that fueled an empire and energized our own palates 2,000 years later. In every kitchen, ancient or modern, the act of cooking remains an expression of creativity, community, and continuity. Romans taught us that food is never merely fuel. It is the language of home, the ritual of gathering, and the bridge between past and present. As we draw to a close, we will tie together these strands and reflect on what ancient Rome's food legacy can teach us today about sustainability, hospitality, and the joy of simple pleasures. We'll offer a few practical tips for bringing Roman-inspired dishes into your own home kitchen, and consider how a dash of history can enrich every meal. Stay with me as we serve up this story's last course, a conclusion seasoned with insight, laughter, and perhaps a recipe or two to carry forward. We've witnessed the grit of field labourers bending under bronze sickles, the hushed solemnity of a Vestal virgin ladling sweet porridge for the gods, and the clang of legionary kettles in distant camps. We've tasted garum's briny punch, felt honey's amber sweetness, and walked spice-scented aisles stretching from Rome to the far reaches of the empire. Now, back in our own kitchens, what can we carry forward from that distant age? First, there is the power of simplicity. Romans knew that the finest olive oil or a pinch of freshly ground pepper could transform plain bread or humble beans into something memorable. To honor that spirit, start with good quality ingredients. Extra virgin olive oil that still carries a hint of green grass, honey with its floral undertones intact, and fresh herbs, rosemary, thyme, or coriander, picked not long ago. When you drizzle oil over roasted vegetables, sprinkle toasted pine nuts over a salad, or grind peppercorns over warm cheese on bread, you're echoing the same gestures that enlivened Roman tables. Equally important is the idea of seasonality. Romans timed their menus to the earth cycle. Spring's tender greens, summer's fig-sweet fruits, autumn's game birds and grape must, winter's root vegetables and preserved pulses. In that rhythm, we find a lesson in sustainability. Eating what's local and ripe not only tastes better, but also cuts down on the carbon footprints of long journeys. Next time you choose ingredients, consider visiting a farmer's market or a community-supported agriculture box. You might discover a variety of squash you never knew existed, or a local apple that bursts with cider-like tang, ingredients that would have thrilled a Roman cook nearly 2 millennia ago. Then there is hospitality. In Rome, inviting friends to share even a simple bowl of lentil stew built community, bridged class divides, and honored both guest and host. We too can reclaim that warmth. Invite a neighbor for a casual supper of Maritim-inspired cheese spread on toasted bread, or offer a midday plate of honey-glazed carrots with a sprinkle of cumin. In doing so, we follow Flavia's example, turning the act of feeding someone into an act of kindness and reminding us that food is most nourishing when shared. Of course, we can also have fun with experimentation. Recall the adventurous spirit of cooks who swapped dormice for poultry or tested small amounts of resin in a honey glaze. Today, that might mean adding a drop of fish sauce to your tomato sauce to deepen its savour, or stirring ground coriander into your morning porridge for an unexpected warmth. You might even try baking flatbreads with pressed patterns, stamping them with a knotted motif made from a twig. These playful touches connect us to the past, turning cooking into a creative adventure rather than a chore. And yes, seasoning with garum's descendants. If you have access to fish sauce in your pantry, treat it like the Romans did, sparingly and selectively. A teaspoon whisked into a vegetable stir-fry, a splash in stews or soups, can bring the same umami lift that made garum so irresistible. Pair it with honey and vinegar to create a quick glaze for roasted meats or root vegetables, just as an ancient cook might have brushed a young boar before placing it on the spit. For those who love a project, try resurrecting a simple Apician recipe. Combine equal parts pine nuts and fresh parsley. Crush them gently in a mortar. Then mix in grated pecorino or parmesan and a drizzle of olive oil. Spread this maritim on warm bread or dollop it onto grilled fish. Or cook artichoke hearts in a bath of white wine vinegar, garlic, and mint leaves until tender. Then serve them with a handful of capers for a bright, tangy appetizer. These dishes require little fuss, but reward patience and attention. Finally, let your meals be a living story. As you cook, imagine Marcus's spelt fields, Livia Julia's hillside vineyards, and the clang of bronze mortars in back alley workshops. In the hum of your blender or the crackle of your oven, hear the echoes of ancient hearths. Share these tales with your dinner companions. Speak of a Vestal blessing over a bowl of porridge, or of a legionary's first taste of fresh-baked panis militaris on a grey morning at the edge of the Rhine. In retelling, history moves from dusty scrolls into the present moment, binding us to those who walked before. In the end, the legacy of ancient Rome's food isn't locked in grand banquets or exotic spices alone. It lives in the simplest acts, kneading dough with a child's hands, gathering olives at dawn, sharing a cup of wine with friends. It thrives in curiosity, in kindness, and in respect for the land that yields our sustenance. As you close this final chapter and step away from the story, carry with you the joy of discovery and the warmth of shared meals. Let every bite remind you that, though centuries separate us from those ancient cooks, we remain united in our love for food, for community, and for the stories that turn each meal into a feast of memory. Thank you for coming on this journey with me tonight. If you enjoyed this story, I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, and maybe even comment on other places you would like to visit, and I'll try and make it happen. May sound sleep and beautiful dreams come to you tonight, my friend. You deserve it.